Marcus wiped the grease from his hands and stared at the broken-down sedan on the side of Highway 47, knowing he was already late to pick up his daughter from daycare, knowing the $15 late fee would get what little was left in his account, but something in the way that elderly woman stood there, frail, confused, her hands trembling as cars roared past without slowing, made him pull over anyway. He didn't know her name, didn't know her story, didn't know that in exactly 4 hours and 23 minutes, his entire life would detonate into something he couldn't have imagined in his wildest, most desperate dreams. Marcus grabbed his toolbox from the back of his rattling pickup, the same truck held together by duct tape and prayers, the same truck his ex-wife had mocked the day she walked out with her new boyfriend and left him with a 6-year-old daughter and a mountain of debt that felt like drowning in slow motion. The woman's name was Eileen, and her eyes were wet with relief when Marcus knelt beside her car, his knees pressing into the gravel, his mind already calculating whether he had time to fix this and still make it before the daycare closed at 6. "Thank you," she whispered, and Marcus just nodded because words felt expensive, because kindness was the only currency he had left that meant anything. The radiator hose had burst, a simple fix if you knew what you were doing, and Marcus had spent 15 years as a mechanic before the shop closed down and took his livelihood with it. Now he worked 3 part-time jobs, grocery store mornings, warehouse afternoons, rideshare nights, stitching together a life from scraps while his daughter Emma asked why they couldn't afford the field trip, why her shoes had holes. Why Daddy always looked so tired. He didn't tell her about the eviction notice taped to their apartment door, didn't tell her that he'd been skipping meals so she could eat, didn't tell her that sometimes he sat in his truck after she fell asleep and cried so hard his chest ached because he didn't know how much longer he could hold the world together with his bare hands. Eileen watched him work with a gratitude that felt too heavy, too profound for something this small, and when he finished and told her she was good to go, she reached for her purse with shaking fingers. "How much do I owe you?" she asked, and Marcus looked at her worn coat, her weathered face, the way her hands moved like someone who'd known hardship intimately, and he shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "Just get home safe." Eileen's eyes filled with tears that spilled over, and she grabbed his hand with a grip stronger than he expected. "You don't understand," she said. "I was on my way to the hospital. My grandson, he's sick, and I'm all he has, and if I didn't get there tonight," her voice broke, and Marcus felt something crack inside his chest because he understood that terror, that bone-deep fear of failing the person who needed you most. "It's okay," he told her. "You're going to make it. Drive careful." She squeezed his hand one more time, whispered another thank you that sounded like a prayer, and drove away into the dying light of a Tuesday evening that felt like every other Tuesday in a life that had become a relentless test of how much one man could endure before breaking completely. Marcus climbed back into his truck, checked the time, cursed under his breath, and drove 70 in a 55 zone praying he wouldn't get pulled over because he couldn't afford the ticket, couldn't afford anything, couldn't afford to be human in a world that charged interest on decency. He made it to the daycare 3 minutes late, handed over the $15 that felt like $1,500, and Emma ran into his arms with a smile that made every sacrifice worth it, made every humiliation bearable, made him believe that maybe, somehow, he was doing enough. They went home to their crumbling apartment where the heat barely worked and the neighbors fought through paper-thin walls, and Marcus made spaghetti with the last box of pasta in the cupboard while Emma colored pictures of houses with big yards and dogs and families that looked nothing like their reality. She fell asleep on the couch before 8, exhausted from a childhood that shouldn't have been this hard, and Marcus carried her to the bed they shared because the apartment only had one bedroom and he couldn't justify taking it from her. He lay on the couch staring at the water-stained ceiling, calculating numbers that never added up, wondering how he'd make rent in 11 days, wondering if this was all there was, an endless loop of struggle and survival with no horizon in sight. The knock came at 9:47 p.m., sharp and insistent, and Marcus's first thought was the landlord coming early to threaten eviction, his second thought was his ex-wife's boyfriend coming to start trouble again, his third thought evaporated when he opened the door and saw a man in a suit that probably cost more than Marcus's truck, flanked by 2 other men who looked like they'd stepped out of a magazine about success and power. "Marcus Holloway?" the man asked, his voice smooth and certain, and Marcus nodded slowly, confusion mixing with a spike of fear because nothing good ever came from strangers in expensive suits showing up at your door after dark. My name is Richard Caldwell, the man said. May I come in? Marcus didn't recognize the name, didn't understand why this man was looking at him with an expression caught between respect and something else, something that looked almost like awe. He stepped aside because saying no felt impossible, and Richard Caldwell entered his shabby apartment with the two other men, their presence making the small space feel even smaller, even more inadequate. I apologize for the late hour, Richard said, glancing around with eyes that took in everything, the peeling wallpaper, the second-hand furniture, the drawings Emma had taped to the walls, and Marcus felt shame burn through him like acid because this was his life laid bare, his failure on display for strangers to judge. What is this about? Marcus asked, his voice harder than he intended because fear made him defensive, made him ready to fight even though he didn't know what he was fighting. Richard reached into his jacket and pulled out a photograph, handed it to Marcus with careful reverence. Do you recognize this woman? He asked, and Marcus looked down at the picture of Eileen, the same woman he'd helped just hours ago, and confusion turned to panic because what if something had happened, what if her car had failed again, what if she hadn't made it to the hospital and somehow they were blaming him? I helped her today, Marcus said quickly. Her radiator hose burst. I fixed it. I didn't charge her anything. I didn't do anything wrong. Richard's expression softened into something Marcus couldn't read. You didn't do anything wrong, Richard said quietly. You did something extraordinary. That woman is Eileen Caldwell. She's my mother. The world tilted sideways, and Marcus grabbed the back of the couch to steady himself because those words didn't make sense, couldn't make sense in the architecture of his life. Your mother, he repeated stupidly, and Richard nodded. My mother, who was driving to see my son in the hospital because he'd been in an accident and I was trapped in meetings 3 states away and couldn't get there in time, Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. My mother, who called me crying with relief after you helped her because she'd been stranded for 40 minutes and every person who passed her just kept driving, just kept going like she didn't exist, like she didn't matter. My mother, who made it to the hospital because of you, who got to hold my son's hand when he woke up from surgery because a stranger with grease on his hands and kindness in his heart stopped when no one else would. Marcus felt tears burning his eyes, felt his throat closing, felt the weight of months of suffering pressing down until he thought he might collapse. I'm glad she made it, he managed to say. I'm glad your son is okay. Richard looked at him with an intensity that made Marcus want to look away. My mother told me you were late picking up your daughter, Richard said. That you paid a late fee because you stopped to help her. She told me you wouldn't take money, that you looked at her and saw someone who needed help and you gave it without asking for anything in return. Richard pulled out his phone, tapped the screen, and showed Marcus a photograph of a young boy in a hospital bed, smiling weakly at the camera. That's my son, Tyler. He's 12. He's going to be fine because my mother got there in time, because you made sure she got there in time. Do you understand what you gave us? Do you understand what that's worth? Marcus shook his head because he didn't understand, couldn't understand why these people were in his apartment treating him like he'd done something miraculous when he'd just done what anyone should do, what his father had taught him before cancer took him when Marcus was 17, that you help people, that you show up, that kindness isn't optional. I didn't do it for a reward, Marcus said, and Richard laughed, a sharp sound filled with something like pain. I know you didn't, Richard said. That's exactly why I'm here. My mother told me about the truck you were driving, told me about the late fee, told me she saw something in your eyes that she recognized, the look of someone carrying more weight than any person should have to carry alone. She asked me to find you. She begged me to help you the way you helped her. One of the other men stepped forward holding a briefcase, and Marcus felt his heart hammering against his ribs because this felt like a dream, like a hallucination born from exhaustion and desperation. Mr. Holloway, the man said formally. My name is James Chen. I'm Mr. Caldwell's attorney. We'd like to discuss your situation. Marcus looked between them, still not believing this was real, still waiting for the punchline or the catch or the moment they told him this was a mistake. My situation, he echoed, and James nodded. Mr. Caldwell is the founder and CEO of Caldwell Industries, James explained. His company specializes in automotive manufacturing and technology. When he learned about your background as a mechanic and your current employment situation, he wanted to make you an offer. Richard stepped closer, his expression serious and sincere. I run a company worth $3 billion, Richard said quietly. I have houses, cars, investments, more money than I could spend in 5 lifetimes. But I wasn't there when my son needed me. I wasn't there when my mother needed me. You were. A man who was already late, already struggling, already carrying the weight of the world, you stopped anyway. That's not something you can buy, Marcus. That's not something you can manufacture or strategize. That's character. That's the kind of person I want in my life, in my company, in my corner. He nodded to James, who opened the briefcase and pulled out documents. I'm offering you a position as the head mechanic at our flagship facility, Richard said. Salary of $120,000 a year, full benefits, housing assistance, education fund for your daughter. I'm also paying off your current debts, all of them. And I'm establishing a trust fund for Emma that will cover her education through graduate school. Marcus's legs gave out, and he sat down hard on the couch, his mind unable to process the numbers, the words, the impossible reality of what was being offered. Why? He whispered, tears streaming down his face now, his body shaking with the release of months of pressure, months of fear, months of believing he was drowning and no one was coming to save him. Why would you do this? Richard sat down beside him, his own eyes wet. Because 4 hours ago, a stranger saved my family, Richard said, his voice breaking. Because my mother is alive and my son got to see her because of you. Because I've spent my whole life building an empire and I forgot what actually matters until a mechanic with a broken-down truck reminded me. Because you deserve this, Marcus. Because your daughter deserves this. Because the world needs to know that kindness isn't weakness, that helping someone doesn't make you a fool, that sometimes the smallest act of decency can change everything. Marcus couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, could only cry in great heaving sobs while Richard put a hand on his shoulder and let him fall apart. Emma appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes, confused by the stranger's and her father's tears. Daddy? She asked in a small voice, and Marcus pulled himself together enough to open his arms, to hold her close, to whisper into her hair that everything was going to be okay now, that they were going to be okay, that the nightmare was finally over. Richard stood, gave them privacy, gestured for his men to prepare the documents. Take your time, he said gently. Read everything, ask questions, make sure this is what you want. But Marcus, I mean every word. You saved my family. Let me help save yours. 3 weeks later, Marcus started his new position at Caldwell Industries, working in a state-of-the-art facility where he wasn't just a mechanic but a leader, a mentor, a valued member of a team that respected his skill and his heart. He moved Emma into a small house with a yard and her own bedroom, watched her face light up with joy so pure it made him believe in miracles again. Richard became not just his employer but his friend, someone who understood that true wealth wasn't measured in dollars but in moments, in second chances and paid-forward kindness and the knowledge that sometimes, when you give everything you have to help a stranger, the universe finds a way to give back tenfold. Eileen visited often, bringing cookies and stories and hugs that felt like absolution for every time Marcus had wondered if he was enough, if he was doing enough, if his efforts mattered at all in a world that seemed designed to punish good people. And on the 1-year anniversary of that Tuesday evening when Marcus pulled over on Highway 47 and changed his life by refusing to drive past someone in need, Richard threw a celebration at his estate where Emma played with Tyler in a pool the size of Marcus's old apartment, where Eileen held Marcus's hands and told him she prayed for him every single night, where Richard raised a glass and said, to Marcus Holloway, the man who proved that heroes don't wear capes, they wear work boots and carry toolboxes and stop when everyone else keeps driving, because that's what real strength looks like. Marcus looked around at the life he built from the ashes of rock bottom, at his daughter laughing without worry for the first time in years, at the people who'd become his family because he'd chosen kindness when kindness cost him everything, and he understood finally that the best investment he'd ever made wasn't in cars or houses or bank accounts, it was in that 15-minute decision to help a stranger, to be late, to sacrifice what little he had because it was the right thing to do. That single choice had rewritten his entire story, had transformed his ending from tragedy to triumph, had proven that sometimes the smallest acts of grace carry the power to move mountains, and that every single time you choose compassion over convenience, you're planting seeds in soil you can't see, growing futures you can't imagine, building a world where no good deed goes unnoticed and no kind heart goes unrewarded. Because someone is always watching, someone is always remembering, and the love you put into the world has a way of finding its way back home.